bunch of years ago, my husband and I were living in this small but beautiful house, and I really loved it because it was so easy to clean, so I was done very quickly. But as our family grew, we started to really outgrow the house, and at some point we realized, like, this isn't working anymore. So we had this vision of getting a big house with a big garden, and that, my husband would do the summer barbecues, and I would cook paellas in the summer, completely ignoring the fact that in Belgium we don't really get summers at all. But anyway, at some point we did find the house that we really wanted to get, and that means that we had to get a mortgage. And one of the things that my parents instilled in me is that you have to compare whenever you make a significant purchase, right, like that. And especially with a rate, it can become a little bit invisible because it's just a fraction of difference. But if you sort of calculate that out over 15 to 30 years that usually people pay off a mortgage, huge difference. So what we basically end up doing is we go to different banks and go and tell the same story all over again. I would like 500,000 euros. I would like to pay that off over 20 years. And please give me a fixed rate because the world is a little bit crazy right now. And then you start to compare, which takes a lot of energy, a lot of time. So you could do that, or you could rely on a loan broker, which is a system that does that exactly for you. So as a customer, I can make a request in that system. First, I'm going to have to pay for it because clearly nothing is for free, right? So therefore, I'm paying money. Now, once I've paid for that, they will calculate credit score to basically see, like, am I even like a trustworthy customer? Am I going to be able to pay back this mortgage? And based on that, we'll see different rates come out. Now, then we will also make a list of the eligible banks because there are so many banks out there, and some of the banks only work with entrepreneurs or only work with premium customers, so we don't want to them all and request for a quote. So once we have all the eligible banks, we'll send a request to get a loan offer, and then when that comes back, of course, we have to see whether some of them gave us an offer, some of them didn't. We're not going to wait forever. Some of them just won't want to give an offer to this type of a customer. And then, of course, we have to translate all of that information because every bank has their own API format and their own data format, which is always so lovely to deal with, right? Once we have translated those offers into something that is meaningful within our own system boundaries, then we can start to rank those results and then present the best available offer to our customer. So I was looking at this and thought, microservices architecture seems like a good fit. And the thing is with microservices architectures is that we look at individual services. Well, they're pretty concise and they're simple and easy to understand, and therefore it can look like the complexity has decreased significantly. However, that's not really true, because what a microservices architecture does is it takes all the complexity and moves it, hides it. Where? Into the connections in between all of those services, that inter-service communication, who calls who, sends what, interchanges what, and reacts based on what, and then what happens from there. So as we transition to these types of systems, it also means that we need to pay a lot more attention to exactly how we draw those lines. How are we going to make all of those services communicate? Because each individual microservice doesn't provide any meaningful business value, right? It's only when we put them together as part of a larger thing that they can really start to provide value in our system. And that becomes especially tricky once we start, having these more complex workflows that we need to get to work in the system, because then sometimes we will have to coordinate some of those things to ensure things happen in the correct way according to our business requirements. And that's what we're looking at today is two coordination mechanisms, which you won't be surprised if you're in this talk. We'll look at orchestration and choreography. Now, in an orchestrated approach, we have a command-driven approach, where there's a central component that is directing the flow and sending commands to individual components. Now, it's also keeping track of all of the state that is basically sort of emerging from those interactions with all of those services, and keeps that state around in that central component. It's also why we tend to refer to it as a state machine. And then it will also make the decisions about what to do and when to do them, and not necessarily how, because it will direct other components what to do by sending them commands. So the individual components still maintain autonomy as well. Now, when we take a look at a choreographed approach, it's a little bit different because we have an event-driven approach, right? We're not sending commands anymore, but we are reacting to events that happen in the system. Now, at this point, we don't have that central component anymore that is communicating with all of those underlying services. Instead, we see that the state also becomes scattered across all of these services because each individual service will only store the state that is relevant to its own service boundary, so to speak. What we then also see is that individual services are going to decide what to do and when to do it by subscribing to meaningful events, and then executing whichever action makes sense from that specific point of view. Now, that's not the only theory we're going to see for the rest of this talk, because I think it's much more useful to look at actual use cases to try to understand what the differences are between those patterns. And that brings me back to our loan broker. So let's assume, for starters, that we are going to design this using orchestration. Now, what happens is that a user then makes the request, and at that point, the orchestrator takes it from there. That's our central component that's managing the flow. We'll make sure that we get paid. Once we get paid, we'll do the credit scoring. From there on, get all the eligible banks, send those quotes. Once we have them, it will ask the ranking component to rank all of those offers so that we can present the best offer to the customer. And this looks great at first sight, right? Because, I mean, there's a central component that's managing everything, so we can go into that code and look what's happening, and that thing owns the process flow, so to speak. It's also pretty easy to understand, and we have all of that state in a single place, so we can go and query that information and see where are we at. But of course, there are also some downsides to this approach. Because, first of all, what we see is that there could be any of those underlying services that becomes unavailable. So what would happen if our credit scoring component is just down? Well, now our orchestrator needs to start caring about these types of events. So it needs to start introducing resilience patterns like retries or back-off mechanisms. Or if it's down for a couple of days, then maybe it needs to have some kind of a backup credit scoring service in case so that it can fulfill its own SLAs. What we also see is that there's a high amount of coupling in between the orchestrator and all of those underlying services that are participating in this workflow, because that orchestrator component now knows about services in this specific scenario. When we see all of that communication happening in between all of the underlying services in that orchestrator, that can also become a lot of information going back and forth, especially when we get a lot of requests. And that can also lead to needs like, we're going to have to scale this out. But when we scale this out, we would like all of the communication that pertains to a single process instance to also go to the same instance that we have scaled out. And then we need a load balancer and stuff like that. And it's all sort of these concerns that then tends to surface the orchestrator as a single point of failure. But it's even worse, because if we then want to go and add a step, let's say that we want to generate an invoice whenever someone pays for one of our services, well, okay, we can introduce an invoicing component, given that that contains sufficient complexity that that's warranted. And now that's not sufficient, because what I also do is to go to that orchestrator and also make the necessary changes so that it will also call that. Now, one of the things that I also tend to see with an orchestrated approach is that there's that single component that manages the flow, and it becomes really easy to go back into that and start adding steps. So it's had a tendency to becoming monolithic. Careful. My audio's a little flaky. Okay, you can hear me. Okay. So when I look at all of these challenges, I'm like, holy bananas, that's a lot of trade-offs, that's a lot of complexity to keep in the back of our minds, and a lot of concerns that we need to be aware of. So let's see if choreography magically solves all of our issues, right? So this is going to look very different, but it's the exact same flow, because now we're going from a command-driven approach to an event-driven approach. So in this case, we have a payments component publishing an event and says, I got paid for a service. Credit scoring reacts to that. Our quoting service is interested in that credit score that just happened to get all the quotes, and then we'll publish any quotes that it has received, and our ranking service will then subscribe to that to then publish an event with the best available offer that we have. And we can start to see that this handles a lot of the downsides that we had before, because now, if our credit scoring component is down, Well, fine, we have all of the meaningful events safely stored on an event bus, and whenever that component is back up, it can continue from there. So we're not going to lose any of that information. We also got rid of temporal coupling this way, because now the communication is asynchronous. We also don't have that centralized component that is coupled to all of the downstream services, and not this one thing that has to handle so much communication that now we have to scale it. No, we can just look at individual components, and if one of them is struggling, then we can start to scale that out or up, whatever makes sense in the scenario. And finally, if we would like to add a step, well, fine, then we can just introduce a new component, add a subscription to a meaningful event, do whatever it is that we want to do, and then publish an event as a result of that. Easy. So when I look at the advantages of a choreographed approach, one of the things that stands out to me in this list is this idea that we got rid of coupling. But there's a flaw in this assumption, so let's discover that a little bit. Now, coupling, as we all know, is not something that we want to entirely get rid of. A completely decoupled system is inoperable because there are no connections, right? So it's something that rather we want to balance. We want to manage it so we have the right amount of essential complexity and avoid all of the accidental complexity. Now, but when we start to look at sort of our coordination mechanisms, we could quickly conclude that, well, orchestration shows a lot of coupling, whereas choreography, not that much. So definitely, choreography must be so much better. But the big flaw in this assumption is that we haven't even talked about which types of coupling I was referring to. I always compare this with pasta. I have a couple of Italian friends. They are sensitive about pasta. So if I would come over and say, all of these spoons, it's just a combination of water and flour and eggs, and therefore it's all the same. Well, probably they wouldn't be my friends anymore. And I want you to sort of take the same approach when you think about coupling, because coupling is a term that we throw around, but people mean very different things with them. There are also very different types of coupling. They introduce very different types of friction into the system that needs to be handled differently as well. So it's really important to keep that in the back of our mind. So whenever someone is saying, oh, this introduces a lot of coupling, or this removes a lot of coupling, ask them, okay, what type of coupling are you referring to? So if I go back to the original sort of types of coupling that I learned about throughout my career, and yes, this is a lot of years ago, then that starts with afferent and efferent coupling. Who's heard of that before? Okay, yes, I'm not alone, thank God. So afferent and efferent coupling were first introduced with object-oriented programming, and they were meant to describe the connections between objects. But I still find it really useful to describe the connections between services in today's sort of distributed world. So afferent coupling refers to all of the incoming connections, so all of the other services that call you and therefore depend on you, so to speak. Whereas efferent or outgoing coupling refers to all of the outgoing connections. So which other components do you call and therefore depend on? And when we try to map this to our coordination mechanisms, then we could also start to see that in a choreographed approach, we see a lot of afferent coupling. There's a lot of subscriptions to events that are meaningful to other services, so many incoming connections to a component that is publishing events. Whereas we see a lot of efferent or outgoing coupling when we use an orchestrated approach, because we have that single component with all of those outgoing connections to all of those underlying services. But the reason that I'm showing it this way is because when we go from an orchestrated approach to a choreographed approach, the coupling is not disappearing. We've just inversed the direction of the coupling. So whenever you're drawing a diagram, you will draw an arrow. It's just going into the opposite direction. Now, this is something that I tend to see a lot when people talk about asynchronous communication and messaging. Oh, it's decoupling. And this is nobody's fault, because a lot of these sort of infrastructure pieces are also marketed that way. Enables decoupling, decoupling, decoupling. But I'm sure you've all realized that you can build an absolutely coupled distributed ball of mud using asynchronous infrastructure. Yes? But there's some truth to this, because when we introduce asynchronous communication into the system, when we're using a message broker or an event bus or whatever it is, we do achieve one type of coupling out of the box. Anyone know which type of coupling that is? Temporal coupling, exactly. So we get rid of temporal coupling. That need for that service to be available at that exact point in time, it's gone because there's an intermediary piece of infrastructure that's keeping track of that message or of that event. But again, this is why it's so important that we differentiate the types of coupling, and also that we differentiate the communication mechanism, which can be synchronous or asynchronous communication, from the coordination mechanism, which can be orchestration or choreography. Because I've seen a sort of tight coupling in a lot of the reading that's out there around orchestration, that it assumes that by definition you should be using synchronous communication. But that's not true. You could perfectly use an orchestrated coordination mechanism and use asynchronous communication underneath. So let's take a look at how that would look like. I'm not going to go over the flow again, because it's the exact same thing. Again, it looks a little bit different, well, significantly different. We've now introduced that message broker in the middle, and there's many, many arrows. And I didn't suffer for no reason drawing this in PowerPoint, because believe me, it was friction. But the reason that I did it this way is to also make it clear that the communication is now asynchronous. So when that orchestrator sends a message to, let's say, that payments component, well, then first that message goes onto the broker, onto the queue, and then whenever payments has the time to deal with that, we'll take that message off the queue and then reply with another message that, again, transfers through that message broker. So it's handled out of band. So we also achieve that temporal decoupling that we got with a choreographed approach. Now, we can still see that that orchestrator has all of those sort of outgoing connections. It's aware of all of those underlying services, even though there's a message broker in between, because it knows which contracts to use. So we still have that contract coupling, that command coupling, because the orchestrator is telling other services what to do. This can also be still subject to high contention, but because we're storing all of those messages in the queue, it becomes a little bit more easy to start to scale out those things, so we regain a little bit of flexibility. So the whole idea of the orchestrator being a single point of failure is a little bit more nuanced when we use asynchronous communication. So where does that bring us, this asynchronous orchestrated approach? Well, basically, we got rid of temporal coupling, like we've discussed. We regained some of that flexibility in terms of scaling these components. We still have contract coupling. You're going to have that in a choreographed approach as well, right? You still know what exactly you're subscribing to. You know what that payload contains. And we'll talk about versioning tomorrow if you want to come see another talk about that. We also still have control coupling. There's still this single component telling other components what to do. And that's coupling, but it also makes it so that you have a single component that shows the process flow, that you can go to and look at the code and understand what is happening and when is it happening. So it becomes easier to understand. And finally, we still have that state centralized, which can actually be very convenient when we're trying to understand the state of that specific workflow. So I'm wondering, which one is now better? Is it orchestration or is it choreography? Yeah, everyone tends to know that this is a trick question at this point. The thing is, I haven't really enabled you to answer that question, because we have not looked at the downsides that a choreographed approach would introduce. So let's take a look at that. And to discuss that, I would like to introduce a completely different workflow. So let's say that we're like, okay, we're ready, we're going to accept this specific offer that the loan broker offered to us. Then there's a whole other workflow that starts inside the bank's domain. And having worked at a bank for 5 years on exactly this domain, there's one or two things that I could tell you about how that would look like. So basically what happens is that we come in, we accept the offer, and at that point, the bank will do an ID check and a credit score check again. Yes, the loan broker already did that. Trust but verify, especially when it comes to money. Once we have that done, you are going to have to sign documents, right? That's basically, at that point, what you're deciding to do. Once all of those documents are signed, we're going to link the repayment account. And you could think, this is just a selection from a Dropbox, but it's not that easy, because basically the account manager will ensure that the account you're going to repay from has a steady income coming in, like a steady stream of incoming money so that you can actually pay that back from that specific account. Once we have that, we will create the loan, calculate the amortization table and all of these complex things, which is that big table of all of the payments that you're going to have to do. We will also calculate interest provisions. Now, as you may know, whenever you pay off a mortgage, part of that is capital, part of that is interest. The interest is what the bank makes from loaning you that money. And what they do with that interest is that they will set some of that money aside to deal with bad debtors or bad assets, and they will also set some of that money aside to reinvest. That's basically how the banks work, so they have an idea of what money do they have flowing around. We will also set up a direct debit, which means that the money is going to come off your account in an automated way every month or every quarter or whatever you said that you wanted to have your repayment frequency to be. And then we will arrange a cash payout to the notary, because we're in Belgium, I'm not sure where you're all from, but in this country, when you get a mortgage, there's absolutely no way you're going to see that money appear on your account, not even for a split second. There's going to be an intermediate party that oversees the sale and acquisition of that house and ensures that, you know, when the deed is signed, that the people get the money for that as well. And once that we have that done, we will come back to the bank with a finalized deed, and that means that the loan can start. So let's assume that we want to model this with a choreographed approach, right? Now we have that quote that's accepted. Our identification service will do an ID check. Credit scoring reacts to that to do the credit scoring. And from that point, the loan can do the amortization calculation that we talked about. And then the documents are also signed. So whenever that happens, our payments service will react to that to set up that cash payout to the notary. Our provisioning service will do its calculation. And our banking will ensure that we have that direct debit set up. So let's consider the downsides of this approach. And the first thing I want to talk about are business failures. And I'm specifically saying business failures, not technical failures. Because if anything goes technically wrong, what do? We retry, exactly. We have resilience patterns to deal with those kinds of things. But what I'm referring to is business failures. Let's say things that happen outside of the happy flow that we didn't really think about. So let's take a look at an example. Let's say we're all excited. We get to the notary. We're like, yes, let's do this. And then they're like, I'm so sorry. The seller's backed out, so this is not going to happen. And we'll get a fee for that and whatever, but we're very, very disappointed. But there's a problem in our domain, because what happens now? Who has the money? The notary has the money, right? So that needs to find its way back. So now what happens is that our payment service, as you'll see later, will have to make sure that that money goes back. So we're introducing an arrow in the opposite direction, or what I like to refer to as bidirectional coupling. Now, at that point, when our loan is canceled, then our interest provisions need to be canceled as well. That direct debit needs to be canceled. I'm not going to pay back a mortgage that I didn't get a house for, clearly. And we may even want to communicate back to our loan broker that this never, ended up materializing into an actual mortgage. What's important, and what I want you to look out for when you are looking at all of these alternate scenarios, is how many arrows are you introducing in the opposite direction. So let's go back to this other diagram. In order for that money to basically flow back into the bank, that's going to be handled by our payment service. So that will publish an event saying that the money has returned, which now our loans component will subscribe to. And this is where we start to see that bidirectional coupling, because earlier, payments was already subscribed to an event from loans, and now we get the opposite. Now then, our loans will publish an event saying that the loan is canceled, and provisioning can react to that to cancel the provisionings, and banking can react to that also to cancel that direct debit, and even our quoting service. So in those three scenarios, we're not introducing bidirectional coupling, but it's important to be aware of how many of these opposite arrows are you introducing every time something happens outside of the happy flow, and how does that affect your design. Now, I tend to think of or compare these sort of compensating flows with knitting, which is one of my favorite hobbies. And, sometimes I'm knitting and I'll make a mistake and I'll drop a stitch and I can see, dropped a stitch, pick it back up, continue, so it's not that bad. And sometimes it's like, I'm going to have to unravel part of this. But it's very rare that I have to go and unravel everything and start from the beginning. And the same tends to be true for our systems. Because these alternate flows that happen beyond the happy path need to be handled and require some previous actions to be undone. But we rarely need to return all the way to the initial state. We're just going to undo the things that make sense to undo and mark this as failed, canceled, or whatever it is. But usually, in order to achieve that state, the same services that were involved in getting you here will be involved in undoing some of those actions. And this is where it can sometimes be a better idea to use an orchestrated approach if you have many of these compensating flows that tend to lead to bidirectional coupling everywhere. So that's something to keep an eye out for. But that's not all, because we could sometimes also see passive-aggressive publishers. And I like to explain this one with an example because, well, it sticks. You won't forget, probably. But my husband is the one who cooks at home on a daily basis. I really appreciate him for that. And the deal that we have is that he cooks, I'll clean up the kitchen. Only makes sense, only fair. But there are some of these days that I enter the kitchen and I'm like, what the hell? Like, did you use every pot and pan that we had in the house? It's like a bomb exploded. And at that point, I could choose to publish an event to state that the kitchen is messy. And I mean, that's a perfectly valid event, right? I mean, it's a state that the system has arrived to, it's happened in the past, and it's a fact. But you can already sense that there's something wrong with this event. And what's wrong with it is my expectations as a publisher. Because when I publish an event stating that the kitchen is messy, I expect my husband to be listening to me, which is one of the first problems that he subscribed to this event. And not only that, but I actually expect specific action to be taken. Not just, oh yeah, I'm sorry. No, I want him to get up and help me clean up the entire mess in the kitchen, right? But I think we can all agree that this type of communication, not really good for your relationships. It's also not really good for your systems because you end up hiding a bunch of coupling. Let's take a look at this. So when we see basically this event where banking is subscribing to the document signed event, what it's then going to do is set up this direct debit for that money to come off my account every month, every quarter, every half a year, whatever it is, right? And from a loans service perspective, this is passive-aggressive communication. Because if that direct debit is not set up, then the loan can't move forward in any way. We won't have anything repaid, and the entire thing would be stuck. So whenever you see this type of a thing, which tends to creep in when you have a choreographed approach, there's two questions that you should be asking yourself. The first one is, well, if it's so important for that loan service to have that direct debit thing set up, then maybe it should be a responsibility that is part of the loan service boundary. Or if you're like, no, setting up direct debits is its whole subdomain, which it is in this specific context, so we can't really do that, fine. Then use command-driven communication. Hey, banking service, please set up this direct debit on this account for me. Hey, dear husband, can you please get up and help me clean up the kitchen? Because that allows you, as a sender, to basically also deal with the repercussions of when that doesn't happen or something goes wrong in there, right? But that's not even all. Because there are also cases in which we face changes, right? So let's imagine that the government comes up with a regulation change, and they're like, you know what? We don't really get very excited when you give mortgages or grant mortgages to, people with a history, with a criminal history. So we'd like you to start checking on that before you give out, significant amounts of money. okay, well, this is a choreographed approach. Remember when I said that adding steps is easy, right? So we're just going to introduce this background checking service. And then we can just subscribe to the credit scoring event, and fine. But it's not really fine, because our loan service was subscribed to the credit scoring event and then continues creating the mortgage and the amortization table and all of that. But that's not really what we wanted to do anymore. We want to also wait for that background check, right? And you could say, okay, that's fine. We can just remove that subscription and then introduce a subscription to that background check service. But now we're touching multiple components again to make one change, to introduce one specific step into that workflow. And this is also something that we see a lot in choreography, is that it's easy to add steps at the tail of the process, but starting to change things along the way becomes a lot more tricky. And actually, what I did here is making it so much worse. Because what I did is that I forced an order. First, we're going to do the credit scoring, and then we're going to do the background checking. But none of my stakeholders told me that I can't do this simultaneously. And I forced in an order by doing it this way. And you could say, well, that's fine, Laila. You could just have that loans component subscribe to both the event from the credit scoring and from the background checking. Yes, but it has to wait for both of them. And what does that mean in an asynchronous world? That I'm going to have to keep track of state. Have I received this event? Have I received that event? Which I tend to refer to as complex prerequisites. I need to have this and that done before I can continue and do something else. And that sounds a lot like orchestration, doesn't it? Now, I'm not saying that this is a reason to then go and turn around the entire flow and no, we're going to orchestrate because we have this one little thing here. No, it's about where do you want to orchestrate and where do you want to choreograph, and understanding where are your real needs coming from. So it's important to think about when you're starting to force order into your system, like, why am I doing that? What am I trying to achieve? And am I dealing with a more complex prerequisite that forces me to wait for multiple things to be true before I continue? This is typically something that, in a choreographed approach, will lead you to force the order in. This also slows you down significantly, right? Because now you wait for this and wait for that. If that's very slow, then you're basically adding to the latency whatever duration it takes to do the background checking while you could have parallelized that. So this is also a trap that is easy to fall into. Now, change is really hard, and what we start to see, especially in a choreographed approach, is that our workflow is emerging from all of those events that are being published. We don't really have a sort of fixed structure to it. I mean, we can draw it in a diagram, and it will be obsolete probably by next week. So we call this sort of emerging behavior. Now, one of the ways to mitigate that is to also start thinking about how would change affect this design? And this is really tricky, right? Because we don't really know what type of change is coming towards us. Now, this is where it can be really interesting to look into residuality theory by Barry O'Reilly, in which he's basically coming up with multiple stressors, things that could possibly change, even if you think that, or you don't know whether it's a probable change or not. You just want to come up with as many stressors as you can possibly think of, and then look at how would this affect this current design? Like, would it break apart? Would it introduce so much bidirectional coupling that it becomes unmanageable? Or would it still be able to sort of withhold and stand its ground, so to speak? And I'm not saying that, oh, if you, because you might expect change now, by definition, you need to orchestrate. It's all about being aware of the design decisions that you make and the trade-offs that you are making, because no solution is absolutely perfect. But it's part of, just healthy risk management to think about these possible things that could happen. And even that's not all, because one of the things that we also see in a choreographed approach is that after some time of building the system and multiple teams cooperating on complex workflows and things like that, we end up with a lack of overview. Like, how does this work? Oh, I don't know. It's kind of tricky. The diagrams that we drew, yeah, they're outdated. So it becomes really hard to start to understand what exactly is happening in the system. So I'll use that term once more. When we use a choreographed approach, the workflow emerges from all of those event chains that are happening. I think emerging behavior is such a sophisticated term, and whenever I hear it in my head, I think I have no idea what the system does. Let me go and execute it, and I will tell you what is happening right there. How do we deal with this? Any ideas? James? We introduce observability. We want to basically be able to quickly understand what is happening in the system. And both me and James would be happy to talk to you about that as well. So observability is important in any kind of distributed system, right? But it's essential when you have this type of communication in your system because it becomes really hard to keep track of what's happening. Because this starts to also show a lot of friction, especially when you don't keep track of this and the system starts growing and growing and growing, and at some point it can start to form into what we call a pinball architecture, where one event is published and it's like ding, 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 ding across the system. It's like, what is happening? Who's subscribing to what and what's happening at the same time? And it becomes really hard to reason about these things. And that becomes especially painful when you need to understand the state of the workflow. Because, oh, yeah, right, let me try and go and figure out all of the services that actually participate into this workflow. Let me see and query those individual states, and then put all of that information together, and then I'll reason about it, and I will tell you what the state of the workflow is. And this becomes especially painful when you have to troubleshoot issues in the workflow and something happened in production and there's a manager breathing down your neck, like, what's happening, right? And what I've seen, unfortunately, is that when this happens with multiple teams that are involved, you see that teams start pointing fingers at each other. Oh, we just subscribed to this event, did our processing, and then we published this event, and from my perspective, everything is fine. So we didn't do it. And when a manager walks into an environment like that, and everyone's like, I'm not responsible, well, guess who is responsible? Everyone. Nobody goes home. If you're lucky, you get to order pizza before you figure this out. So it's important that we consider these challenges up front and we think about what would be the repercussions of that. And at this point, you might be thinking, really? Laila, I mean, I came to this talk to get some better insights on whether I should use orchestration or choreography, and I just came out so much more confused. And the thing is that these are not easy decisions. And the reality of it is that it depends, right? I'm like, oh gosh, no, the consultant answered. And I get it, like that's very difficult to deal with, especially in a real life scenario. So I would like you to walk away with a little, something more useful than just an it depends. Because what I've done over the years is, as I've had to solve many of these problems, is I came up with a couple of questions that help me sort of guide me through this decision-making of which coordination mechanism to use. And that consists of 5 questions, starting with what type of communication is best suited in this specific scenario? Like, should we use synchronous communication or asynchronous communication? Because if we're using synchronous communication, then it is more likely that we'll use an orchestrated coordination mechanism. It's not a yes or no flag. It's not a black and white answer. It's a spectrum, right? But it is more likely that you're going to orchestrate. If you're like, no, we're using asynchronous communication, well, then you could go either way. And it's important to have all of these types of decisions driven by your business requirements, not by whatever you want to achieve technically. Now, the next question that I will keep in the back of my mind is, do we have complex prerequisites? Like we saw some examples of that before, right? Before I can start a loan, I need that customer to be identified. I need to ensure that they have an adequate credit scoring. I need to ensure that we've done that background checking, right? Those are complex prerequisites where we need to do multiple things, but wait for all of those things to have happened before we can continue. When you start to see a lot of that, it also means that you're going to have to keep track of that state that is moving so that you can decide when all of those prerequisites are met. So it is more likely that you want to orchestrate at least that little part. If you're like, no, I don't really have any of those, then it is much more likely that a choreographed approach will work well for you in this specific scenario. The third question I will look like is, actually, I should change this question. Are there complex compensating flows? There are always compensating flows. The question is how many and how complex are they, and how much bidirectional coupling do they introduce? One of the pitfalls of building systems is that we go and follow requirements, right? And our business stakeholders will always start by telling us the happy flow. It's our responsibility to go and dig for the less happy flows. What happens if this goes wrong? Could this go wrong? And what's the user supposed to do, or what's the system supposed to do? And it's really important for us to explore all of those things that are happening outside that happy flow and start to look at how they affect our designs. So the more compensating flows they have, the more complex they are, the more steps back we need to take, the more likely it is that we want to orchestrate that. Why? Because if we want to undo a bunch of things that we did, well, usually, like I said earlier, the same underlying services will be involved in undoing part of that work. And the orchestrator was already coupled to those underlying services. So in order to undo, we are not introducing additional coupling. If you're like, no, really, this is super straightforward, nothing that can meaningfully go wrong, or it's very limited and it's not really affecting our design in meaningful ways, then you could say, okay, then a choreographed approach might be a better sort of solution for you. Another question I will ask myself is there a high probability of change? And this is not just about changes in the domain. This is also about how well do we understand the domain to begin with. Because if we don't understand our business requirements well, if we don't have access to our business stakeholders to ask questions about all of these things that, could happen outside the happy path, what are more probable or less probable changes, what are the things that we want to be prepared for, and what are the things that we don't necessarily want to prepare for because it would be an investment that we don't want to make right now. These are decisions that we want to surface, discuss with our stakeholders, and let them make the decisions about how extensively to basically make this architecture robust or not. But when we don't have access to our business stakeholders, then it's going to change, by definition, through progressive insights. Because as you learn more and more about the domain, you'll have a better understanding of it, and that changes your understanding of that model, of that domain, and therefore you're going to design it differently. So that's another angle that is really important to keep in the back of your mind. So if you're like, okay, there's a high probability of change because we don't have access to stakeholders, I don't understand this domain, or because it's very volatile and there are definitely things that we may want to be prepared for, then an orchestrated approach gives you that flexibility of a single component that you can go to, see what the workflow is, see how to handle that workflow, and make changes in there. If you're like, no, I've been working in this company for, a decade, and I've been working really closely with my stakeholders, this is a very stable domain, okay, then it can be much safer to say, well, we're safe, so we can choreograph with a lot more comfort here. And then the final question I will ask myself is, who is responsible for this workflow? Now, this is also where I like to refer to the retail domain. The whole workflow of placing an order, right? We want to pay for it, we want to ship it, we want an invoice, this and that. That is a specific domain that you could solve with orchestration, and you can solve it with choreography. And both of those end results will work and will look good. However, I continuously see different teams choosing completely different solutions. And one of the reasons that I've seen is that the angle is responsibility. I want to have a single team to go and shout to if that order hasn't been shipped within the SLA of a single day or whatever it is. I want to have a single set of people to go to when something goes wrong. I don't want to have multiple teams that are managing that workflow because it's very crucial to my business. Or it's not. I don't mind actually figuring this out. So it depends, like, do you have that high sense of responsibility or not? Because when you do, an orchestrated approach gives you that, because you could basically make that orchestrator, that specific workflow, the responsibility of a single team. If you're like, no, we work together really well, and we like to have autonomous teams, and we are fine not having a single team that is responsible for the entire workflow, then a choreographed approach can work equally well. But it's important that you think about this, that you have those discussions of is this important to us or not? So these are the sort of 5 questions that I use to guide myself when I try to make a decision on which coordination mechanism is the most important one. And I have all of these in my resources at the end with a lot of additional information, so that's going to give you probably a lot more information than just a picture for those of you who care about looking a little bit deeper into this. But what's also really important when you use this sort of mental framework, if you will, is that you continuously guard the size of your workflow. Because what I've also seen that if the scope of your workflow is way too large, you will almost always end up in an orchestrated approach. Because you will have complex prerequisites, and you will have the need for asynchronous communication in some parts, and you will really also have all of these compensating flows that you need to take care of that introduce a lot of bidirectional coupling. You will have a very high sense of responsibility because it's so huge that you feel that you have to manage it. And all of these concerns will lead you to an orchestrated approach. So it's really important to actively also look like, what are the sub-workflows that I can isolate away from this and that I could make different decisions for? So a lot of this is also sort of iterating and seeing what are the parts that I can basically pull out and reevaluate my decisions for and split things into dedicated sub-workflows. Now, I've done this talk a bunch of times. I've talked to a lot of people about this. I also workshop about this, so a lot of conversations over the years with our customers and all of that. And sometimes people will come up to me and say, but Laila, why are you making this so incredibly complicated? Like, haven't you heard of the rule of thumb? I mean, you just orchestrate within service boundaries and you choreograph across, and then it's easy. Why do I have to go through this decision framework? Anyone heard of this before? Okay, a couple of hands. Generally, I think this is a pretty decent guideline. But I'm not a black and white thinker. There's so many shades of gray in the world. And one of the reasons I particularly hate this almost is because it's based on a very big assumption. That you got your service boundaries right. Which, come on, that's like the first thing that we tend to get wrong, because we don't know the domain sufficiently, or because things are changing that cause us to reevaluate our service boundaries and cause us to have to rearrange things. And if you then let yourself guide yourself by something that you had set in a point in time, then you might be making things significantly worse for yourself. So that's why I still go through the exercise of using these questions, and when it leads me to orchestrate across service boundaries, logical service boundaries, not necessarily physically deployed units, but logical service boundaries, then it also indicates to me that something is off, so that will cause me to reevaluate also my boundary, like, is something wrong? But as we also all know from having to go through these experiences, is that changing service boundaries is really hard. Because, yeah, they're owned by different teams, and now we need to coordinate, now we need to talk to them, and now we need to plan, and this and that. So doing those changes is not straightforward, and that's why when you are in those cases, you are at least hurting yourself less by then saying, no, I'm going to orchestrate across, because this is in the wrong boundary. And that brings me to the end. So I hope with this talk I have convinced you that there is no right or wrong coordination mechanism. Both orchestration and choreography will be part of a well-designed and well-architected distributed system. And the art is really about finding where do I use each coordination mechanism and how does that fit into the big picture. So it's not an or story, it's an and story, and mostly a where story. So it's important that you keep identifying those sub-workflows that could be isolated. You can use those 5 questions to guide you and continuously go through that exercise of reevaluating your service boundaries, because change is inevitable. Everything will keep on changing, and that means that we need to reevaluate our previous assumptions and see whether everything is still holding up. And most importantly, that you become aware of the trade-offs that you are making. Thanks a lot for listening. Here are the resources that I promised earlier. It's a GitHub repository. If you have any questions, I am happy to hear them.